Hey everybody, I hope everyone is doing well with this whole coronavirus thing. I hope you're all safe and that your papers are going well, or at least better than mine. Um, so normally I write a paper that is kind of structurally similar to just like a typical logical argument in philosophy, because that's kind of what I'm comfortable with. I took a little bit of a different approach with this one. It's a little bit more kind of like based in like metaphor and figurative language. And I'm also borrowing from hermeneutics and like philosophy of interpretation in general by tying in some work from Gadamer that we didn't talk about this semester that I encountered in Culbertson's course, Philosophy of Human Communication. So I don't know if you've already read my abstract or not, but my whole paper is completely different now. Um, but I'm just going to give you like a general walkthrough of it. Hopefully, it's clear and precise enough. I just went through everything last night and a little bit this morning, so it's changing every second. Hopefully, it's clear. Um, so, my paper's title is Art in the Hermeneutic Circle: How Art Reveals the Unseen by Entrenching Us into Dialogue. My thesis is that while art is not limited by this function, it carries with it as a part of its essence the primary characteristic of allowing us to see what we could not beforehand, both physically and abstractly, and furthermore that we can experience this through engagement with the hermeneutic circle. I'll use primarily the art of Goldsworthy and Tanizaki in Praise of Shadows to defend the instantiation of this primary characteristic. However, I'll also be using some examples outside of our discussions this semester through the work of Tanizaki paired with Gadamer. I hope to illuminate the method in which we extrapolate truth and meaning from art. For me, the most potent examples and the examples that I picked are Goldsworthy's Maple Leaves, which was the photo, if you recall, of the tree that has bright leaves around its roots, and it kind of like highlights the bottom of the tree. A work called Nsala by Alice Seeley Harris. You may have seen this before, I don't know. It's of a man in the Congo, or a Congolese man rather, holding a small sort of like canvas cloth that within it are the hands and feet of his daughter. Um, it was a photo that was taken during Leopold's sort of like genocide of Africa for the rubber trade. So I'll be using that work, and I'll also be using a work called The House of Asterion by Borges. This work is it is a work that's sort of retelling the Minotaur myth from Greek myth. In a way that is just completely different because it's actually written from the perspective of the Minotaur rather than the perspective of like Theseus or a god who's like describing what had happened. So in Goldsworthy, the maple leaves around the tree highlight the tree, and what's special about this is that it makes the tree seem so independent of its surroundings, and it brings something that you weren't noticing beforehand into view. I didn't really notice the tree beforehand. I saw like the whole, like the forest, right? I didn't see like the parts of the forest. I just saw, look, there's a tree in the forest, like there's another blade of grass. I just see the lawn. I don't see just the blade of grass. So for me, this artwork does a really great job of singling something out and bringing it into a new light. Nsala, I've just explained that to you, but this work was important to me because I really wasn't aware of that genocide before I had seen that photo when I was like 16 or 17 or something. It claimed 20 million African people, like at minimum. And this happened, like 30 years before, before Hitler happened, during like World War II. But this really showed the brutality of Leopold of Belgium. And what's important about this art, like what it's bringing forth, is not only a historical accounting of something that happened, but also a portrayal of the brutality and the toxicity that human beings can really encompass, right? Like, and especially of like the toxic nature of power. To see a father or really any person holding the hands and feet of their child because you know the person overseeing them wanted them to be more efficient at collecting rubber. I mean, that's barbarism on a level that is thankfully almost unheard of today. Um, and in Asterion by Borges, we're introduced to this figure that is socially deprived, waiting for an end to its suffering at the hands of a noble hero who will deliver him to peace. Within that peace, we then discover that the identity of this lonesome individual is the Minotaur waiting for Theseus to end his lonely exile. So the reason why I chose these three is because every piece of art alludes to both the context that created it and the truth or the meaning that resides within it, which will always reside within obscurity. This is where Tanizaki comes in. After all, I mean, like, what is a shadow if not something that obscures, hides, or alludes to something deeper? It's the very nature of shadows, is to cover or obscure something, to make it more difficult to see. But there's a plus to this. And when you combine this with, like, Gadamer, right? Like, Gadamer's hermeneutic circle plays well with Tanizaki's in praise of shadows, in my opinion, and that shadows reveal truth through obscurity. When you meet something with four conceptions and simply accept those four conceptions, right? Like your first interaction with something, whether, you know, like my first interaction with a guitar was something like this right here, right? I'm like, okay, yeah, that's a guitar. And then I saw this guitar some years later, and I was like, wow, like I've never seen that like that before. It made me realize that like a guitar is more than a tool. It can also be a piece of art in and of itself. So your first impression of something is, well, while it's important, it can be incredibly limiting, especially if it's just seemingly obvious, right? Like if you take that and you run, then like what do you have? You haven't engaged with it, you haven't interpreted anything, you've just gone off of this like reflection of something and then left. So I think that when we like meaningfully engage in art, we do so through the hermeneutic circle, and that it's a dialectical approach, and that when you combine Tanizaki and Gadamer, we arrive at something really interesting. Because shadow provides obscurity, texture, sometimes infinite depth, in which we continuously explore through this dialogue of asking, what do you mean to a piece of art? And then we like listen for an echoed reply that we can barely make out, right? Like if you look at, you know, something by like Picasso, or like the Minotaur works from Picasso, right? Like, oh, like what does this mean? And you try to like look into it, and the scene being depicted is this Minotaur, you know, like sexually assaulting this woman. You know, like it says something to me about like toxic masculinity, and then of course when you find out later that like Picasso is totally a rapist, you can see like this is a situation where like the art is just really giving way to the context that created it. But it's something that's obscured and it's not immediately obvious. While that one is like very potent and it hits you suddenly, that doesn't necessarily mean that the meaning there is obvious, right? So, you know, in general, like I ask you, what requires you to engage more? That which seems obvious or illuminated, right? Like well lit, in the case of like Tanizaki, when he talks about Western culture, bright lights, like if everything is just well lit and you can see everything all the time, I mean, you just take things at surface level and you don't engage with them, in my mind. Or right, like that which hides from you, as I'm mentioning, like things that hide from you, things that are obscured in darkness and shadow that you can't make out, like whether you're squinting to like try to like, what is that over there? You're engaging in this practice of trying to really meaningfully discern the truth of a thing. And this, you know, this extends like outside of art, but I think it's particularly interesting in the case of art. So Tanizaki's view of shadows, granted this is my interpretation, has its own merit within the world of art, but in this case I do think shadow can be seen as the defense of ongoing interpretation, where a bright light represents the loss of engaging with something critically. I think it's valuable to take Tanizaki's shadows and apply them both literally and metaphorically. Shadows, whether literal or metaphorical, force us to really meaningfully engage with art due to the loss of the immediacy that we have become so accustomed to. When this immediacy is lost, we do not fully engage with something. We don't ask what something is and wait for a response. We take our first impressions of it, and we accept it, and we move on. This is the antithesis of meaningful interpretation. This may seem controversial, but to me, like, I would ask, you know, if something is immediate and the meaning seems like it's just staring you in the face, like, is that good art, or is it even art at all? Um, if we come at something from Gadamer's method of meeting something with your foreconceptions and then allowing it to be challenged, we as observers potentially have the ability to make anything art. Um, but I do think that there's a value of something that is challenging from the get-go, that doesn't require you to make it challenging. Um, and that's like really great art. But I do want to be clear that I think that when applying like this method of sort of like Gadamer's um, detail of dialogue and understanding and truth and method, um, this combined with like the nature of obscurity and shadows and truth that is not immediate, I think that if we apply those things to anything, we can turn something that wasn't maybe necessarily art into art, or bring it into the world of art, and that is where we can gain more from it. It becomes more meaningful, and we gain access to those truths. So I hope that, I know it was a little off kilter. It's kind of early in the morning for me. I'm a little bit tongue-tied right now. I'm going to try to put links to those pieces of art in like a description, I guess, or in the bottom, so that you can check them out. The House of Asterion by Borges can be read in like less than like 10 minutes, especially if you're just like listening to it. And then the other two being pictures, I'll just put in links into the bottom there. But I hope this was clear. If you have any critiques or feedback, feel free to just dump it in there somewhere. Right now, everything's really fluid and changing. I usually write something that's like really structured. I find my claims and then I defend my claims. In this case, I'm doing a little bit less of that, so everything's a little bit muddier. And so if you have feedback, I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you, stay safe, and enjoy everyone else's presentation.